think about the way you interact with water. Thanks for turning on the recording, Jamaica. So welcome everyone to World Water Day. And the theme this year is groundwater. And I think before we talk about groundwater, it's a good idea to ground ourselves. If you all want to take a moment to join me and just settle your tailbone on your seat and take a deep breath and drop into this space. Think about the land that you're on and who came before you there. And think about the state of the place that you are and whether you in your life or whether you aspire to be a better steward of that place that you are. I think that's probably one reason why any of us are here today, is to learn. I'm here to learn from these experts that have been assembled for this day. I'm so grateful to be able to be here with you all here in Ojai, California, which is unceded Chumash land. And boy, is groundwater ever the topic for us here. At the moment, there are lawyers in the next city over that are parsing out whether the groundwater basin that I'm currently sitting on is connected to the groundwater basin in the lower valley, because there's a lawsuit going on. Our downstream neighbor, there are two communities that rely on the Ventura River, and our downstream neighbor is suing every landowner in the upstream basin, so including my parents. They dropped more than 14,000 lawsuits during the Christmas holiday a couple years ago. And so this case has been dragging on, and each side is bringing their experts that are coming in from all over the place, because California has their eye on this watershed. It's one of the watersheds that's been targeted for in-stream flow enhancement, because our area has become so degraded over time. It's desertifying. This particular part of Ventura County, where Ojai is the single fastest warming region in the contiguous United States. We've raised 2.5 Celsius since the industrial era, which is nearly 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And so much like a lot of the communities in the West, Ojai and this region is finding itself having built a society around a water future that was thought to be more certain than it was, based on looking at too small of scale of precipitation regime or flow regime and making long-term assessments. But we're coming to find out California is a wild climate. And as climate change, as this crisis increases, I find myself coming to water as being the single thing to focus on for both climate adaptation, right? In order to adapt to the warming climate, we need to reassess and realign our relationship with water, to start storing more of it in the soil, to start storing more of it in vegetation, and all of the positive feedback loops that come with improving and aligning that relationship with water. It's critical for us for climate adaptation. And from a mitigation standpoint, all those activities, all those interventions with the land, those are also carbon mitigation. They're drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. And so they're also a carbon solution. So I feel like water is the ultimate truth. It's the right place to be really concentrating on and focusing on. And so with that, I'm going to leave it to the experts. Our first panelist is Judith Schwartz. Sorry. Judith, she's an author. She tells stories. She illuminates. She's a science writer. She takes science and makes these concepts approachable and gives them cultural nuance. She just takes a clear-eyed look at global environmental, economic, and social challenges, and she finds answers in natural systems around us. She's published several books, including The New Water Paradigm. And her mission really is to increase water literacy. And she's gonna be talking to us today about the cooling effects of evapotranspiration and how forests make rain. So Judith, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, and hearing about what it's like in Ojai, that's very sobering, because here where I live, we get ample water. So, just realizing, how fortunate we are, and to, just, take in how varied our situations are. It is wonderful to be here with all of you water people, water advocates, practitioners, students of water all. Actually, we're by definition all water people, since our bodies are comprised of 70% water. I like how Brock Dahlman of the Water Institute, he spoke earlier today, likes to sign his emails, mostly water. I think that's perfect. World Water Day is a good time to rethink how we look at water. We often talk about water as a noun, as a thing that's bounded by place. The word resource often locks us into that box. So water is seen as something that I have or you have and I can take it or sell it to you or have a, do a lawsuit about it. Water privatization, I'm looking at you. But I think it's also important to understand water as a verb. Water is always in motion. It expands in volume or retrenches. It retains or releases energy. It changes state, moving from gas to liquid to solid and back again in an ongoing dialogue with land and sun. I believe that understanding how water works, how it moves across the landscape and through the atmosphere, will help us address our many global challenges. Because water interacts with every system: climate, biodiversity, food security, and the way our landscapes function. So here is a plug for water literacy, for learning about water and learning from water, so that we can better work with water rather than trying to get water to do what we want it to do, which, as we've seen, doesn't serve us, doesn't work out so well. A wonderful journalist named Erica Gies has a book coming out in June with the title Water Always Wins. I'm very much looking forward to the book, but I also want to make the point that it needn't be a zero-sum game, that we and all life can win too by understanding, honoring, and working with water. Let's linger for a moment on climate. I know, let's start out light. One reason I wrote a book about water, that the book is Water in Plain Sight, Hope for a Thirsty World, is that whenever I saw the connection between water and climate, it was always like expressed from the standpoint of climate change will put added stress on water resources throughout the world. And of course, that is really a concern, and we're seeing how this plays out all over. But at that point, the impact that water has on climate was not even in the conversation. And so I wanted to bring it into the conversation, and I'm excited that these conversations are now happening, as in this one. So if we step back and ask the question, how does the planet manage heat? We will see that it is mostly through water-based processes, primarily the phase changes of water, which embody tremendous transfers of heat energy. So yes, let's bring water into the climate conversation from the perspective of how we can work with water to address climate change. Specifically, let's look at the water process of transpiration, in which water moves upward through plants and is released as water vapor. Now, liquid water turned to a gas phase of water. Ever boil hot water on a stove? So we know that this requires energy. It uses or consumes energy. Therefore, this is a cooling mechanism. Plants are dissipating solar energy, transforming it into a latent form of heat embodied in water vapor, as opposed to sensible heat or heat you can feel, like, if you step on a hot sidewalk. According to Jan Pokorny, a botanist from the Czech Republic and one of the authors of the book, the small book that completely blew me away when I read it several years ago, the book, The New Water Paradigm, Water for the Recovery of the Climate. So Jan Pokorny says that the transpiration capacity of one good-sized tree on a sunny day can have 3 times the cooling power of an air conditioning system in a 5-star hotel. There is a quote I like from water innovator Peter Andrews from Australia. He says, almost haiku-like, that plants manage water, and in managing water, they are managing heat. Now that's something you might want to kind of sit with a second, because there's a lot in those few words. Again, I'll just say it again. Plants manage water, and in managing water, they are managing heat. He notes also that we have effectively devegetated about 1/4 of the planet, thereby destroying that heat regulating capacity. Yet this also points to where we have agency to revegetate degraded landscapes, to restore this regulation function. We can do this. In the aggregate, trees move around an extraordinary quantity of water. Brazilian scientist Antonio Donato Nobre describes forest-driven aerial rivers, bodies of moisture that sail unnoticed through the sky. He says airborne waterways above the Amazon rainforest contain more water than the Amazon River below. That's a lot of water. In an essay called Clouds, Rachel Carson wrote, "Up there is another ocean, the air ocean that envelops the whole globe." To a large extent, weather comes down to the agency of trees. Trees cast out moisture, they're transpiring and they're sending this aerial river, through the atmosphere. But they also pull it in. According to a theory called the biotic pump, the cumulative transpiration of trees in a forest forms a low pressure zone. This creates a vacuum which draws in moisture. The laden air cools and condenses over the forest, and we have rain. So a healthy forest is at once sending water abroad and tugging water in from elsewhere. It is a dynamic system as moisture both rides the current and creates it. So we have a scenario where trees and clouds are talking to each other. So one more point before I turn it over to the others, and that is the connection between water and biodiversity. So it's understood that all life depends on water, but it's also important to recognize that water also depends on life. For example, we've got all that moisture in the atmosphere, the aerial rivers. What brings that water, that moisture back to Earth? This happens through condensation, the process in which water molecules gather or condense to form clouds, fog, and dew. To create rain, there needs to be another element, some tiny speck for that raindrop to condense around. Nature, life, provides a variety of precipitation nuclei. That would include ice crystals, bacteria, fungal spores, pollen, scented compounds emitted from trees. Antonio Nobre calls these latter molecules scents of the forest or fairy dust. And so clouds and vegetation become partners in rain. We can think of this as an important element of the small, or really it kind of is the small water cycle. Water cycling in place, rising as vapor and descending as precipitation. In a healthy ecosystem, water stays where it falls, so that a single raindrop can circulate numerous times before leaving the area. Water depends on life in another important way, in that the presence and activities of multiple species slows down water so that it can meander and sink into the ground as opposed to just running off and disappearing. Think of beavers whose dams slow water and create wetlands that support multiple other species, or prairie dogs who dig tunnels that allow water to flow and remain in dry landscapes, or even the humble earthworm who makes pathways for water in the soil. And so climate is largely driven by water processes, and water processes are largely driven by life. It's not helpful then to look at water in isolation because water is always in relation. So on that score, I will leave you with a quote from Spanish meteorologist and atmospheric physicist. And anyway, he's like got zillion PhDs, this fellow, Mian, who I had the pleasure of spending a few days with in 2018. He says, water begets water, soil is the womb, and vegetation is the midwife. So water, soil, vegetation. This gives us our mission to preserve and restore healthy ecosystems so that we can ally with water and thrive. So thank you to all. I look forward to engaging with the rest of the conversation. Thanks.
Wow, thank you, Judith. That was incredible. It's so much to digest there. And I mean, everything from you talk about the cooling effects of evapotranspiration. I think back to when I was living in New York City and the feeling in the summertime of being in Manhattan amid that urban heat island effect, where the concrete would increase the sensible heat off of the sidewalk, sometimes 15 to 20 degrees higher than the actual temperature was. And then you cross into Central Park and it would actually be 15 degrees cooler than it was in the sidewalk, or sometimes even cooler than the rest of the ambient air temperature. And so when we talk about the importance of those cooling effects, I think a lot about our urban areas, and so many of them are designed with insufficient canopy to provide that effect. My question for you, Judy, is, you've written a few books on the topic, and I think so much of what you're talking about and how we accomplish these things, how we accomplish the hydroliteracy that is necessary to transform society. I think so much of it comes down to right, like what the policy is, how do we convince policymakers that these incentives are greater than, for example, the material and monetary incentive of deforestation, things like that. And so for me, it comes down to, okay, how do we shift policy? We shift policy through culture, and we shift culture through storytelling. And you're a storyteller. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about maybe some advice that folks on the call on this talk can take away in terms of how we talk about these things to our friends and neighbors and colleagues, because it takes all of us, each in our places. Most of the land that has been degraded is also privatized, and so it's like it takes this parcel by parcel approach of people who are on land. Can you talk a bit about the storytelling aspect?
Wow. Well, I guess, that's a huge question. How do we, do this huge cultural, societal shift? But I guess I would say, and this is something that stories do, is, well, okay, invite people's curiosity and also speak to people's kind of inherent understanding. I think that people intuitively understand this, how water works, once you draw attention to it. We've got our heads stuffed with like concentrations of CO2, with what this person is saying, what that person is arguing, so we often don't see what is in front of us. But if you talk to people and say, hey, just what you said, hey, it's really interesting that I remember when I was living in New York and the concrete was just soaking in the heat, and how wonderful it was to go to where there were plants. And hey, maybe this is something that we can do, and maybe we can do together. And if these are people in your community, talk about what might be possible for you there. So I think it's just engaging in conversations, not trying to convince, but inviting in. Because I really do, like I said, I really do think this is intuitive because we've all had these experiences. We know that it feels good to be around plants. We humans evolved in relation to healthy ecosystems and plants. So it's in us. And it's just a matter of inviting that back.
Uh, as someone who is a science and climate communicator, I couldn't agree more. Um, it's once a person has that awareness, right? From that awareness grows and then flows, and you can't help but do something about it. And I think for so many people, they're really at that point where it's like the message is getting out there. Everyone feels pretty aware that things are amiss and that something needs to be done about it, but not knowing quite what to do. And so I feel like that's what a lot of today is about, is getting us to that place where it's like, okay, I more or less have an idea of what I need to be doing, which is getting in tune with the land around me, with my neighbors, talking and coming up with a plan and executing. Judy talked a bit about the biotic pump, all right, and the small water cycle. And I remember reading Mikhail Kravich's book a couple of years ago, and a line struck me where he talked about the disproportionate amount of precipitation that is provided to land from land, right? So in an area like Ojai, I would think that all of our precipitation is coming from the Pacific, and a lot of it probably is, but there is such a significant portion, depending where you are, it's oftentimes up to 2/3 and maybe even 3/4 of the precipitation you get is coming from the land. If you're further inland, it's even more of it is coming from the land. So what we do on the land matters. And our next speaker is Alpha Low, and he's going to talk to us a bit about some of the physics behind what Judy was talking about, and what Alpha's done. Alpha is he's a water physicist, and he looks at water from the microscopic level. I have a little bit more of an introduction here too. He's working to restore water cycles. He's the author of the Climate Water Project on Substack, and he also wrote a book called the Open Collaboration Encyclopedia. And he has just kind of gone headlong and fully dedicated himself to this mission of increasing water literacy. And so here he is to talk about some of the physics behind water and the way it moves through space around us.
Thank you. Appreciate. I'm just gonna turn on the share thing here. Let's see here. So, so we're in a time of a lot of environmental issues right now. We have floods, we have fires, we have droughts, we have heat waves, and we have water scarcity. And these issues are interlinked. With droughts and heat waves, it dries up the land so that it makes fires more likely. And the fires degrade the soil. So then when the water rains come down, it doesn't get absorbed into the soil and creates these floods. And the floods then erode soil and landslides and degrade the soil so that it doesn't hold the water. So then when the dry season comes, it's a lot worse. So there's this cycle that we've gotten into, and all around the world now, from Australia to Greece to Brazil to British Columbia, in California, like everywhere you look, there's these fires and floods and droughts and heat waves. And I don't think it's been fully grasped by a lot of the public how intertwined these are, and also how intertwined it is with the water cycle, and that we actually can do something about the water cycle. And that's really important to realize that. And the water cycle is, in some ways, a more complicated story than the carbon story. Just like it's like the greenhouse effect is heating it up. And there's so many things going on in the water cycle, from the evapotranspiration to cooling to swales that guide water into the earth. Like, how do we understand all of this? And so we've been actually I brought about 20-something people to try and figure out some of the water principles, to kind of condense this story into an easily understandable story. And the idea is we each come up with different versions. So I'm going to show you a version that I think kind of starts to explain the complexities, and in a way that really shows us, oh, we can actually help with this droughts, these fires, and these floods, and these heat waves, and the water scarcity issues. So so basically, the way to look at it is through these 5 aspects. The water flows through the land, through the underground, and up in the air. And the air is invisible, it's water vapor. So we sometimes forget about that, but there's huge amounts of water vapor flowing around up there, and it's having a big impact down below. The water is also shifting the heat around. And so we focused a bit on the carbon aspect of heating up, but water is actually does a lot of things to shift the heat around with its various abilities to change phases and its abilities to move around. And then water also redistributes the soils and the sediments. And that's key because that's how life grows and where life grows. And water redistributes the pollutants. And then it's also important to note there's a feedback loop between the water, the microbes, the fungi, the vegetation, and the animal. So those are kind of the way, one of the ways to kind of see all the many aspects of water and how begin to understand how we might use those aspects to help deal with droughts, heats, fires, floods, and water scarcity. So let's start off with the land. So 1A here, the land. So so that you can slow it and spread it, and Brock Dolman coined these terms along with sink it. And it's sometimes you look at a dry creek bed and you might not realize you can actually make those creek beds run longer, because basically if you slow the water by infiltrating into the soil or various things like swales or biomass upstream, you can actually slow the water. So it actually keeps streams running into the drought season, into the dry season. And you could spread it around too, like beavers build dams that spread the water laterally. And so this is actually a key aspect of hydrating. So our droughts don't have to be so devastating. We can keep the plants hydrated. And Peter Andrews in Australia has done a lot of work around this with natural sequence farming. He's shown that we can actually keep, your plants can keep growing even though it's not raining. And so our droughts don't have to be quite so devastating. So this slow it, spread it, and then storing it in wetlands and ponds is key to dealing with it. And what's also interesting is that this is the same way to deal with floods. If we slow down the waters in the upstream or goes into the infiltration into the soil, it doesn't all accumulate into these huge velocities downstream and create these huge, it helps ameliorate some of the strengths of this flooding. So these are, I mean, it sounds simple, but they're actually pretty profound and the impact. And I don't think we really realize it. It's not, it hasn't infiltrated in the mass consciousness, the importance of this. And then underground is also really important. If the soil and the wetlands, they can guide the water underground, and the underground actually stores in a cooler place, and the underground can actually keep the water there so that it's available into the drought season. And so there's ways that plants can actually use capillary action, other things to actually use some of the underground water. And so the underground is very key, and it's actually like a bank. And so we need to be able to how to fill it up. And so a lot of places like Ogallala, and like in the Midwest, they're drawing up all the aquifers. In Central California, they're drawing it all up. Like essentially, there's ways to actually fill up all these aquifers again. And that's actually the way to actually keep the keep a lot of the water for usage. And LA is actually now building a lot of wetlands, some I think maybe even $1 billion projects to build wetlands in LA, so that we can actually sink the water underground and then use wells to draw it up. And so we don't have to pipe in water from elsewhere. And the way we've done our modern water system is not, it's clever, but it's not wise, because we've built dams, aqueducts, and farm irrigation systems. So there's pipes underneath our modern farming systems that drain away all the water from the soil out to the ocean. And so that actually depletes the whole continent of water. So that in itself is this huge aspect that we're not realizing that's causing all these droughts and all these fires and all these floods, is that the industrial farming system is draining water way fast out. And it's also related to the dams and the aqueducts, because instead of catching the water in the wetlands, we're catching it in these dams. And then the dams filter to these farms. But the dams themselves have to release a lot of water when they have these huge atmospheric rivers and floods, because they need to create a buffer. So even though they're supposed to be storing water from wet season for the dry season, they actually lose a lot of that water. So it's not an efficient system. And no one's really like pointing the finger for all the cause of droughts, fires, and floods at the dam, farm, aqueduct system. And so it's important that we kind of point this out and also point at the solutions. And then the aspect of the air, because it's invisible, we don't realize that the evapotranspiration can actually increase the humidity in the air to create rains. And so Milan, who Judith mentioned earlier, was showing how Spain gradually is losing its rains because of urbanization. It's paving over the soil so it can't evapotranspire. And so we have to be very wary of what we're doing with the asphalt and the concrete to, destroy some of these rains, and which also destroys the fog and the dew, which are also helping with environmental hydration. And then there's ways it's transporting. So it's actually, there's moisture hopping. So the water is actually hopping inland. So if you have a chain of forests, it actually brings in all the moisture inland. But as we destroy our forests, they're actually not allowing the water to come in. So what happens with the water is it rains onto the ground, the forests gather it and pass it up to the air again. And then it's called a small water cycle, but the small water cycle keeps passing the water inland. So this is a key aspect that is also being ignored a lot, like this whole aerial path of the water and how it's actually transporting water around. And if we use it, that's the way to get the water to the farms. And instead we use this dam aqueduct system. But basically, and still a lot of the world, unlike the US, is using rainfall as farming. And so it's having huge impacts on farming in a lot of places where the rain is disappearing or moving around or getting more variable. And then heat is also very key. So, I mean, we're having heat waves all around, like Portland, I think, had way over 100 degrees Fahrenheit last year. And we're having these huge heat problems in urban heat islands, because urban heat islands are caused because we're not letting the water be there. We've paved it over, so the water can't evapotranspire. So basically, water can evapotranspire and cool the earth. So basically, it's shifting. Basically, what's happening is the water shifting the heat is shifting from the surface of the earth up into the atmosphere. And so that's what we can do. We can shift it up, and when it's up further in the atmosphere, it's not as problematical for life on the earth. We can also transform it, so the sun's rays can be transformed, energy of that rain can be transformed into the latent energy of the water. And then these forests can also create low-lying clouds that then reflect some of this radiation back out to space. And then the water also does stuff with the soil and the sediments, like the more trees you have, that you hold the water so it doesn't erode. And then the rivers can guide the soils. And then the waters also, wetlands can cleanse the water. The microbes in the soil and in the wetlands can clean the water naturally. So we don't need to use as much of these chemical cleansing methods. And then there's a huge feedback loop. So basically with the water, the microbes, the fungi, the vegetation, and the animals, so that there's what happens is called ecological succession, so that if a system is left to organically grow, it actually leads to healthy and healthier ways of using water. So yeah, so that's basically a kind of overview of how we can restore the water cycle and how it can help with drought, heat, fires, floods, and water scarcity. And then I won't go into this, but basically there's a lot of ways to do this. And this is a whole pattern language, all these different methods, from swales to leaky weirs to beavers. And so all these methods kind of form a pattern language of how to actually activate these methods of slowing, sinking, spreading, the things in the previous slide. And so these are the different aspects. And so this forms what's called this new water paradigm. And I think it should be named because it's a field that, and so maybe there's names like regenerative water or water ecology. And it should be made up of the practitioners who are practicing on the ground, and then also the scientists. And I think that hasn't been fully merged yet. So in the practice, it's quite a lot the small water cycle. In the climate science world, it's called precipitation recycling, moisture recycling, and also moisture hopping as the water goes inland. And so I think we need to merge a lot of the work that's being done so that practitioners and the scientists work together. And then also this needs to infiltrate the more modern hydrological movement, which are implementing a lot of urban hydrology structures that don't understand all this. So we need to frame it in that language so that we can move this paradigm in. And then the science will help get it into the modern hydrology world and into the governmental legal, laws and stuff. So yeah, so that's my sharing. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Alpha. Moisture hopping is that's a fascinating concept I haven't heard described like that, and I'm very interested in so many aspects of what you're talking about. But I think one of the biggest things I drew from your presentation is the importance, like all of the ways that water moves through the different mediums, right? Air, soil. The one that has the most benefits stacked and creates the greatest buffer for extremes is banking it in the soil, because in the process of doing that, it's not like, well, the water just falls on the ground and sinks straight into the aquifer. It is so productive along the way, and performs so many functions, so many ecosystem services as it does that. And since precipitation is one of the biggest unknowns with climate change, clouds are very difficult to model. Computers don't quite have the resolution and capacity to effectively model cloud cover. And so how much light gets reflected from the earth, and also how precipitation regimes will shift, like where these clouds are induced or inhibited from developing, are some big unknowns. So when rain does fall, we have to do our best to guide it and bank it, as you were saying, Alpha, in the soil. I have a quick story that leads into a question, which is, when I was fresh out of grad school, having studied climate science and society, I was home and I was in town down at Libby Bowl, and there was a woman walking through the trees, and we were talking about the drought, and she mentioned something about, the trees call the rain. And I remember at the time thinking to myself, like, the trees call the rain. What is she like? The trees don't call the rain. That's not true. But, as I've gotten further in my learning about water, she was right. Right? The trees do call the rain. That's what G was talking about. And I would love, Alpha, if you could explain a little bit about terpenes and cloud condensing nuclei, and how exactly that process, how exactly does this moisture hopping happen? Something that maybe we can visualize.
Yeah, so forests give off bacteria, and these bacteria concede the formation of condensation of the water, because it allows ice to form around it in the air. So that's a key aspect of how the precipitation forms. And then also sometimes the air in there doesn't have enough humidity to actually create rain. So if you add in the evapotranspiration, that water, it takes it above what's called the dew point. So when there's enough water vapor in the air, it actually condenses. And so the forests help take that above the dew point, and then the bacteria help also condense it and form rain. And then what happens is that it blows a little bit further inland, or it travels somehow, that water vapor that's come down from the trees out further to the next forest, and then it comes down. So it kind of hops. And so there's been models that show that the Midwest drought in 2012 was actually caused by California's drought, because so much of the Midwest water is actually coming from moisture hopping. It hops from California into the Midwest. And that's why earlier this morning, you saw Michael Kravich's slide that as you go in further inland from California, it actually gets drier and drier, because we haven't built that whole forest. It used to be, the US used to be much more forest and much more wetlands. So it allowed that moisture hopping to happen, but now it's been destroyed. And so, we don't realize, most people are not talking that the Midwest drought was caused by California's problem with the water. They're not bringing enough water to pass on with moisture hopping.
That makes so much sense when you think about the size of California and the fact that it's lost 95% of its wetlands. That's a lot of water lost to the atmosphere that would have been evapotranspiring.
And the woman who researched Francina Dominguez, the climate scientist, who did that research.
Would you pop that name into the chat for everybody, Alpha?
Yeah. And I think it would be good. Like, as I kind of went into the literature, I found there were so many amazing climate scientists that a lot of the water practitioners don't know, that are doing really cool research on the small water cycle. Only they're calling it something else. moisture hopping and moisture recycling.
Hey, Alpha, can you go ahead and switch back to stop
yeah.
sharing screen?
Okay, yeah, there you go.
Thank you so much. All right. It's a great segue into our next speaker, because so much of what he talks about is really a groundwater focus, and what he's going to focus on today, which is the theme of World Water Day. Our next speaker is Hart Hagen. Hart is a Louisville-based environmental educator. He's a naturalist and a landscaper. He's a park steward and a citizen journalist. Kind of sounds a lot like how I describe myself to Hart. He's covered climate change extensively, and biodiversity, and he believes that only living systems will save us. And with concepts to guide us like permaculture and regenerative farming, he sees them as being essential for planetary and cultural strength and healing. Hart, so excited to hear from you today about groundwater.
Thank you, Peter, and it's a privilege to be here. So the theme of World Water Day this year is groundwater, and I understand groundwater to mean everything, including right beneath the surface. It's not just what we pump from the aquifers unsustainably, but it's what is occurring, what's there because of fairly recent rainfall, or even rainfall from a few years ago, but stored in the soil. So Mikhail Kravchuk, author of A New Water Paradigm, Water for the Recovery of Climate, says that each year the Earth loses 760 cubic kilometers of water. So think of something that's like 8 kilometers, I don't know what 760 is if you take the cube root of it, but it's a lot of water. In fact, the Lake Michigan is 50 cubic kilometers. So if my math is right, we lose 15 Lake Michigans of fresh water every year. And it's like, how long can that go on? And it's getting faster as time goes on. And the American West, the last 20 years has been according to the New York Times, has been the driest 20-year period in the last 1,200 years. So how much water disappears each year from the American West, and can the droughts in the American West conceivably be related to the amount of water that is just disappearing? And not necessarily, maybe greenhouse gases have a role to play, but can we talk about water disappearing and what we might do to steward the land so that the water does not disappear at the rate of 760 cubic kilometers per year? So if you sewed my lips shut and then handed me a glass of water, he says, here, have a drink. I'm going, WTF, my lips are sewn shut. I can't drink the water that you're handing me. Actually, I wouldn't say that, because my lips are sewn shut. I'd be going like that. So it's adding insult to injury. The land is like that. We make the land so that it cannot absorb the rain that falls, and then naturally the land cannot drink the water that falls in rain. So how can we change this situation? How can we let the land drink the water? And we could talk about plants, we could talk about forests, we could talk about earthworks such as swales and keyline system and check dams. We could talk about all that. We could talk about landscapes, farms, forests, but I'm going to focus on soil. So how do we treat our soils so that the land can drink the rain that falls? And the answer is nearly everything we've seen our entire lives in gardening and farming, we have to not do that and do something different. All of our lives, we've seen tillage, but tillage is extremely damaging. We need to not do that. Tillage destroys the soil structure. Soil with structure has air pockets that can catch the rain. We need to stop using chemical fertilizers. If we use fertilizers, they need to be compost that is rich with life, because soil, functioning soil in nature is rich with life. And the fertilizers kill that life and destroy the structure and the living biodiversity in the soil. We need to stop using herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. The side on the end of those words means kill. When we use herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, irrespective of how it becomes toxic to the air, the water in our bodies, it's killing the life in the soil, and it's killing the life above ground, which would otherwise contribute to the biological diversity of the soil. All of our lives, we've seen a lot of bare ground. We need 50% of the crop fields worldwide are, over half of the crop fields worldwide are bare at any given point in time. We need to cover that bare ground with living plants and or organic matter, such as wood chips and leaves and clippings from the crop cuttings.
Hey, Hart, is that
Yeah.
is that what you mean when you say that much water is disappearing? Do you mean that it's simply not being held in the landscape? It's evaporating or being shed off to the ocean?
Yeah, let me clarify. Thank you for asking. It's not in fact disappearing, is it? But it is that much fresh water is not there anymore. So it's fresh water. So it either evaporates into the atmosphere or it goes into the oceans. McCall says that adds 2 millimeters to the oceans every year. So it's going into the oceans because it's draining. So it's draining as opposed to, it's not soaking into the ground. It's not becoming groundwater. It's not being stored in the plants. It is going way too fast into our streams and rivers so that it flows into the ocean and becomes part of the salt water, or it goes into the atmosphere where it doesn't come down very readily or very easily because it stays up there in a haze, most of it.
Right. So it's essentially we're shortening the water cycle in a way. The water's it's not cycling through the process as it should. It's being sped through because it's not being retained.
That's my understanding from reading Judy's book. She was talking about how, you want to slow the water down. You want to give the water a circuitous route through the plants, through the soil. Tortuosity is a word that has popped up recently. You want to give the water a tortuous route so that it slows down. It should not. The worst thing that can happen to a raindrop is to rush into the waterways. Hot, polluted water. We need that water on the land. We need more water to sink into the ground and less water to rush into the streams and waterways. So Thank you for the question, Peter. The last item on how to treat our soils is all of our lives we've seen monocultures, which is one crop as far as the eye can see, or at least one crop in a particular area. The Midwest is vast acreage, miles and miles of one crop. Corn as far as the eye can see, soybeans as far as the eye can see, wheat as far as the eye can see. Monoculture, nature abhors a monoculture. Nature is diverse. Anything that's a monoculture, you're working hard to keep nature out. And that's where all of the insecticides and fungicides and pesticides come from, because they're an attempt to keep nature out. Here's a pest that wants to invade, and it's like, here's a feast. But biologically diverse systems keep those pests in check. You have problems with pests and predators and pathogens in a biologically diverse farm, but for the most part, a diverse, robust ecosystem can control the pathogens and pests and many of the predators. So we need biologically diverse farms. We need a whole lot less monocultures. We need our farms to have, a variety of animals, a variety of plants, and even some wildlife hanging out. So the last couple of things is, okay, so we've been talking about how can what are the results of all this? If you avoid tillage, avoid chemical fertilizers, avoid herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, if you avoid having bare ground, but you have living plants and or organic matter on top of the bare ground, if you have biologically diverse farms instead of monocultures, what are the results of all this? So a very good witness to what happens and how to make it happen is Gabe Brown, author of Dirt to Soil. For a long time, if not still, it was the number one selling agricultural book on Amazon. It's a wonderful book. And so in 2019, storm clouds were gathering in North Dakota, where Gabe's farm is. It was predicted to rain an inch, and it started raining, and it rained, 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 and there was 13.6 inches of rain in 22 hours, over a foot of rain in less than a day. Nearly all of that rain soaked in to Gabe Brown's farm, because for decades he had been increasing the quality of his soil. So is that what we want? Is that what, North Dakota is not California, but isn't that what California needs? Isn't that what the American West needs? Isn't that what Kentucky needs? That's where I am. And, even if you have, yeah.
It's what the planet needs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So my last, what's the call to action? We can do a lot of things. Call to action. Eat local as much as you can. Eat foods that are grown locally. Because so much of our farmland, how we eat determines how our farmland is used. And it determines whether the farmland is going to be a place that soaks up the rain, or whether it's going to be a place that where there's runoff. Either there's runoff or there's infiltration. You can't have both. It's either going to infiltrate or it's going to run off. Our farmland is made to have runoff and erosion. That's what you can predict. It's going to happen because of the way farming is done now. And the federal policy incentivizes all of this crap. But so eat local. Grow something if you can, even if it's a potted plant on your balcony. You can grow peppers or garlic or basil or whatever. Try to grow. Nobody can do everything, but try to grow something. Number two, buy from local farmers. Number three, get to know other local farmers, that even if they're not ones that you're going to buy from, like especially urban farmers. These are scrappy people that are growing something on 1/8 of an acre, and they're making it happen, and they're doing it for all the right reasons. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks for that call to action, Hart. I posted it in the chat for everyone so you can see it. Eat foods grown locally. Try to grow something. Buy from local farmers. Get to know your local farmers, especially urban farmers. I love this call to action. Hart, what can we really do to save the climate and our biodiversity?
Thank you for the question, Peter. I was anticipating it, and I have a handy dandy Post-it with my notes as to how I would like to answer that question. So here's how to really solve, and if you're asking me, and you are, so here's how to really solve climate change. I mean, if you read the New York Times, if you read Inside Climate News, it's just that there's just so little. It's the answers, the understanding of the problem and the understanding of the solution is just so narrow and so limited. And it doesn't have to be an either or. I mean, if you want to talk about carbon, we got your solutions to carbon, but carbon is not the only thing we need to think about. So true solutions. And I want to shout out to Judith Schwartz. She got me started on this journey about a year ago because I happened to buy one of her books. It introduced me to all of this, including Michael Kravchuk and Walter Guinea and other people on this call. But okay, so solving how to really solve the climate crisis. One is we need to be holistic. You can't be reductionistic. We need to be holistic. We need holistic, comprehensive solutions. We can't be focusing on one little bitty narrow element or compound or substance and acting like that's the whole thing, because the public starts to think that, that one substance is the whole thing, and it's not the whole thing. It's part of a system. So we need to be holistic. Number two, our solutions need to be accessible. We need all hands on deck. Everybody needs to do a little bit of something. So people need to understand what's going on. You can't just leave it to the scientists. And we need solutions that are understandable and intuitive. And one of my items here is we need to, we can't dismiss observation, intuition, or common sense. The solutions we offer, I like saying that, we in this movement believe that, I think I speak for most of us, that is, why do we have a problem with climate? Because we have removed living systems. And the solution is to replace living systems on forests, farms, landscapes, gardens, and underground, and in our waterways. We need to restore those living systems, because it's the living systems that are going to manage the climate and cool the air, with the fringe benefit of biodiversity and good food to eat and clean fresh water available locally where you are, not having to pipe it in from who knows where, and not having to ship in food from who knows where. Most locations in this world can accommodate that. And lastly, our solutions need to be fun and action oriented. There's so much that we can have fun, and we can have fun taking action. It'll return us to our roots as farmers, as gardeners, as hunters, as fishermen, as restoring, observing nature, learning about animals, learning about plants. It absolutely is, for many of us, a return home. And that's what we can do, and that's what we can be.
Hart, thanks so much for driving home the point that the climate crisis, right, is just so much more than an emissions issue, isn't it? It's, the issue with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is approaching 420 parts per million by the end of this month. The climate crisis is that is one component of a multiplicity of ways that we're currently living disconnected and outside of the natural boundaries of wherever we are. Mm-hmm. And so with that, it leads so well, almost like this panel was designed for them to lead into each other. The next, because the next speaker, Ananda Fitzsimmons, is going to talk about decolonization, and that term. Sorry, I just noticed there's a horse loose on the hill. I think it'll be okay. you know, it's most of us where we are, our ancestors came here from somewhere else, right? And each time they moved around, you have to go through the process of indigenation yourself, right? So if you look at Hart's call to action of eating foods growing locally, trying to grow something, buying from local farmers, just that the practice of doing that, that is a process of indigenation. You're relying on what can be grown within your immediate area, which by doing that, it just stacks benefits. I think Hart said they're fringe benefits. I would say they are that is the juice, that is the salt. These fringe benefits of eating these ways is just a overall more abundant, more healthful life for all of us, more thriving. And so Ananda Fitzsimmons, who just took over the screen with Decolonizing Our Relationship with Nature and Creating Regenerative Culture, is the president and co-founder of Regeneration Canada. She's the author of Hydrate the Earth, The Forgotten Role of Water in the Climate Crisis. Ananda, we're so happy to hear from you.
I'll mute myself, it will go a lot better. Yeah, so I want to shift, as you said, it is sort of all the previous comments just sort of led right into what I want to talk about. Because it's one thing to be water literate and understand what the principles of hydrating the earth are all about, but there really is a much bigger thing that we need to shift, and that is really changing as a culture, as a global culture, changing our relationship with nature and creating a more regenerative culture. Because history has shown us that the colonial attitude in the past several hundreds of years, as humankind has spread across the planet, there's been a global culture that is extremely human-centric, and we think about exploiting nature for our own needs. And somebody mentioned earlier, just using the word resources, even the word exploiting natural resources is really common parlance. And that's just very reflective of how the entire global culture works. We deplete the land, then we move on and go and take somebody else's land. And the history of colonization has been one of reverse evolution. So the pictures on this slide are pictures of the Loess Plateau, a restoration project that was done in China and documented by John Liu with the National Geographic at the time. And the picture on the left shows a segment of that restoration project where they took barren, dead desert soil and dug trenches in the soil, and then they stuffed straw into those trenches and just waited for it to rain. And when it rained, there started to be, with the combination of straw, which is carbon, and rain, which is water, there began a process of bacterial decomposition, which just generated into biodiversity. One thing led to another, and without planting trees or doing anything else, just putting carbon and water kick-started a process of evolution of biodiversity. And then after a number of years, there was vegetation on the land, and the land came back to life. So you could say colonization, everywhere that colonization has come, we've reduced soil carbon, we've reduced rain and water cycles, and we've reduced biodiversity. So we really need to stop reversing evolution and start regenerating. And on this slide, you can see the process, the progress of people over a few hundred years taking over the surface of the earth, where you see on the left side where the entire planet used to be covered in natural ecosystems. And gradually over time, we move to where you see on the right, where there's barely any natural land. There's a very, very small percentage of natural ecosystems, and the rest is human managed ecosystems, with an extremely large percent of that being industrial agriculture. And it's possible to live in a different way. We know that indigenous people lived on the earth for millennia before we came along, and in a very sustainable way. So I think we need to look to the model of how indigenous people lived and the wisdom that indigenous people had. And there was a report that came out in 2019 that showed us that indigenous peoples are still preserving biodiversity, because even though they represent only 5% of the world's population, indigenous people steward 25% of the terrestrial land surface, which houses the greatest biodiversity and the most intact ecosystems. So that example tells us that we need to begin creating a regenerative culture by changing our thinking, by changing the way we see the world. And just as indigenous people and cultures saw themselves as being a part of nature, we need to see ourselves as part of nature and see that all creation is our relative. And when we destroy nature, we destroy ourselves, we destroy the planet. And we need to stop doing that. We need to think of ourselves as belonging to the earth. And the map in this picture is a map that was done by Grasshopper Geography, a guy that does maps of every continent on the planet. And this is the North American continent, or Turtle Island, and it's defined only by its watersheds. So every different color represents a watershed. And can we begin to start thinking of ourselves in a different way, thinking of ourselves, where we are in relation to the land, where we live in relation to our bioregion, to our watershed, and start to understand the dynamics of where we live as part of our relationship to the land. Just being more tuned into the land, knowing, when the moon is full, and following the seasons and being more in touch. And our accounting system, the global economic system, is the way that we account as a culture, as a global culture for value, is counted on GDP, which is really the only thing that counts are the transactions of goods and services, the things that we put money on. That's the only thing that's valuable. And this really needs to shift, because we know that that is not the only thing that's valuable. In our accounting systems, we account for the gray infrastructure, every building, every brick, every pipe, every wire, things that were produced and manufactured by human beings that we had to pay money to get. That has value, but it has no value without the green infrastructure, which is, the gifts that nature has given us that we have taken for granted and treated so badly. So our entire accounting system, our finance system, needs to change. And it's interesting because there are some things going on which I find really fascinating, and I think that need to be accelerated, maybe with the help of all of us. But the UK Finance Department commissioned a study by Sir Partha Dasgupta, which came out in 2019, and he really told it like it is. And here's a quote from him. He said, "So the solution starts with understanding and accepting a simple truth. Our economies are embedded within nature, not external to it. We need to change how we think, act, and measure success. Transformative change is possible, and we and our descendants deserve nothing less." So he did have the vision. We need to, create a different system to account for what is really important and really valuable. And then there was a series of other reports that came out focusing on the biodiversity crisis, but the need to increase nature-based solutions in a timely manner. So studies are being done on how we control investments in nature-based solutions by 2030, and there's a huge funding gap. So they're looking at different funding mechanisms and structures for how can we change this? How can we start to really put our money where our mouth is, put our money on what's important and funnel money to it? Because as long as the accounting system only puts value on goods and services, we continue to incentivize the destruction of nature, and we need new mechanisms to do that. So that's going on a high level, but down here on Earth, all of us, what can we do? We have a short window of time to create a different society. And not all of us is a farmer or has a big piece of land or has $1 million to invest. So what can we do? So there's little things that you can do that add up, that are part of this idea of decolonizing the way we think, the culture that we have around us. You can increase the biodiversity in your backyard or your neighborhood, get involved in a community food forest or a community garden, do a little guerrilla planting, feed the birds. We need to change our aesthetic, like what we think of as beautiful, because in our culture, this is what man-made ecosystems tend to look like, with a reduction of biodiversity, reduction of water, reduction of carbon, and natural ecosystems look like this. So let's get used to, people still get a hard time if they don't kill the dandelions and mow their backyard. So let's change the aesthetic, let's change the culture and begin to see this as beauty. We need to support the Indigenous land defenders. There are Indigenous land defenders all over the world putting their lives on the line to defend their way of life and defend their land. And they're doing it, it's important for themselves, but it's important for all of us, because as we see, they really are defending the biodiversity. They really do have cultural ways of being and thinking that we could be positively influenced by. So let's get behind them. Let's support those movements, sign the petitions, donate money, go out and join them, get to know them, whatever you can do. And as Hart said, we can support local regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of farmers that are building their soil carbon, restoring water, increasing their biodiversity, and we can support them by our food buying choices. We need to get behind them. We need to shift the food system, the commodity system, the monocultures that our food is getting shipped out to other countries. Let's increase the local momentum for buying and create market demand for the things that can be created through agroecology and regenerative agriculture. We can encourage this movement to change financing, ethical impact funds. There are things that are being created, but they need a lot more stimulus. There's a great demand for them. You don't have to be a really rich person. Most of us do have retirement savings funds that are invested in something. We can talk to our financial advisors and see what the options are. This thing is changing rapidly, so keeping up to date on that and just thinking about what you can do is one more thing that everyone can do. And finally, I'm sure you can think of a lot of other things. We all have our special gifts, our special magic, and we can use those to create community projects, to create art, to do education, to raise awareness. So I really invite you all to think long and deep about that, increase your water literacy, and think about how you can pitch in, because it's going to take all of us. And so just the last thing is, in terms of increasing your water literacy, a little plug here. This is Judith's book, Water in Plain Sight, my book, Hydrate the Earth, and Heart's Water and Climate Facebook group, which anyone can join. So I'll just leave it there.
Wow, thank you, Ananda. I was going to ask you if you had any maybe like personal decolonization tips that you practice in your own life, like maybe little things that you do that help you kind of indigenate yourself to your local area. Maybe tell us where that is. And
yeah, I think really spending some time in nature and cultivating that sense of connectedness. Like I really like to celebrate the seasons, the solstice and equinox seasons. I like to be aware of the phases of the moon, go outside, get together with people, you know, sing and dance and talk about what's going on. Talk about growing food. If you can grow food, it helps put you in touch with the cycles of the seasons and, you know, just, you know, being more connected, like to the land, to the weather, to the movement of the seasons, and doing that in a collective way to help more of us be more plugged into, you know, we are of the earth, we are part of the earth. And if we're too lost in our schedules and our computers, it's easy to forget that. So I think it's really important that whatever you do, work these days usually involves sitting down in front of a computer, but like, let's get our butts outside and remember to connect with nature.
I will accept that calling. I mean, being back home in Ohio where I grew up, I never felt so connected to the land as I do now, having gone through a permaculture course this past year up in Quail Springs, which is in the mountains above Ojai. And then that prompted me to think and connect with the land that I'm on in a wholly different way, because you go through that whole process of thinking about and assessing, and you do a protracted and thoughtful observation of the land from different places. And so I built a sustainable trail into the back acres of the land that I grew up on that I would never felt connected to. And I go back there every day now, and how it's doing informs so much of my read on what's happening and what's going around me. We have just under 10 minutes left in the session, and I posted in the chat that you were all invited to ask any questions, which you can submit in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question in general or for a specific panelist. Please go ahead and do that. You're invited. Steve, looks like he's got his hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me there?
Hey, Steve, you're a little bit broken up, but we can kind of hear you. Go ahead.
All right, I can hear you now. Better? Can you hear me?
Hey, Steve, it looks like we can't. Your connection's broken. So why don't you go ahead and mute yourself, and we'll see if anyone else can get one through. Sorry about that.
Okay, you can't hear me? Can you hear me there now?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We got you now, Steve. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. I'm just fiddling with Wi-Fi and things. Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment. I was thinking earlier that water's dominant influence on the climate. Many climate advocates haven't come to that understanding yet. And I thought I had was just to make it as easy. Like, these people have invested a lot of credibility, a lot of their life energy into the carbon narrative. So strategize these
Hey,
so
hey, Steve, we actually,
question, comment, anyone who wants to comment on it? Sorry, you go.
Steve, I'm not sure if your question made it all the way through. Was anyone able to make that out? Sorry, Steve, you were kind of broken and unreadable there. But maybe you can submit your
Okay, no
question in
worries.
the chat.
Will do.
Steve, go
Okay,
ahead.
thanks.
Yeah, go ahead and submit your question to
You
the
can hear
chat,
me?
and
Yep.
maybe one of the panelists. Why don't you go ahead and submit your question to the chat, and maybe
Okay,
one of the
thanks.
panelists can respond to you separately. Hey, Michaela, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself?
Hi, I'm Michaela. I live in Quebec in the St. Lawrence River and Great Lakes watershed area in Abenaki territory. Last week I went to an International Women's Day, I guess the week before, International Women's Day meeting by the Ontario Native Women's Association. And the title of the webinar was Breaking Bias. And an Indigenous wisdom keeper was asked, what have you done in your life to make change, to break bias? And I loved her answer. She spoke really slowly, deeply, and she just said, I don't really think of it as breaking. I think of it as unbraiding and rebraiding, small, because I think in the face of large problems, we often feel a sense of, are we going to come up with a big enough good solution? And we overlook the power of the small braiding, unbraiding and rebraiding of just each one of us, our next right step, and look more to the power of a quantum solutions rather than, for me, the new paradigm is not opposing or trying to shift coherently one angle, but more to move away from opposing the way things are going to immediately to diversity and what we each can do and feed empowerment, because when we speak about how horrible things are, I often find we end up with the sense of feeding, like the way Joanna Macy talks about apathy. And so I just wonder if part of the equation of becoming literate is to not have like such a narrow understanding of we need to do this, but more of a promotion of a really widespread ways that people can plug in small ways. Because if we do that, it will the changes we need to make are not only possible, they're inevitable. And
Yeah.
Bishop Tutu that's his message around the world to young people, is the changes you're so worried we won't achieve are actually inevitable. And that feeling of empowerment I just find it's just so much easier to get people to action by valuing all the small steps that each one of us make.
Yeah, I don't know if we're right at 4:30. Michaela, thank you so much for your question and for kind of like really bringing together everything that we talked about, which is the new water paradigm really is a shifting of culture, isn't it? It's a shift in consciousness and awareness, and it requires more than just understanding facts, right? It means learning and integrating, absorbing, and channeling, putting into action every day in your life. And I think that's what the new water paradigm is all about. And I think that's what we are doing and what we did here today all together, which is sending out that positive ripple. But we are right at 4:30. I want to invite any of the panelists or Jamaica. Thank you so much for hosting. Any closing thoughts? I want to echo the call to action from Heart, and really from each of our speakers, which is to do as best you can, make as strong and sincere an effort as you can, wherever you are, whatever that place is, to come to a better understanding, a higher water consciousness, a higher water literacy and intelligence, and get engaged. And whether that's civically or with, actually making interventions on the land where you are. You don't have to necessarily be a property owner or be on land to indigenate yourself and make a huge difference.
Yeah, I just want to say that this event is put on by our Regenerative Water Alliance, and so yeah, you can contact us. I put the email in the chat, and I don't know, Jamaica, did you want to say a few things about Regenerative
I just
Water
added it
Alliance?
in the chat just to say that this is part of the ongoing intent of the Regenerative Water Alliance, just to bring programming and also our regular series of meetings. We're working on various strategies and building partnerships and just sort of building more webs of connection between various practitioners and experts, all looking to kind of mobilize and unify our efforts versus where we've been siloed and distributed, trying to sort of tackle it alone. So we welcome people to continue to participate. Our next meeting actually is next Thursday, but after that, we're every 3 weeks. We do have an Australian time. We wanted to accommodate our global communities. So JP, to your point, we do have a call time that's in the afternoon Pacific time, and then one in the morning. So please either write to the email that Alpha put up or to me at jamaica@openfuturecoalition.com, or just put it here in the chat. And we're happy to just incorporate you into the ongoing conversations and discussions and mobilization. But thank you to all of you who joined this rich conversation today. I also have recorded both the chat and the recording. So if you'd like to have a copy of the recording, just really quickly before we go, put your email in the chat and we'll share this incredibly treasure trove. All day for World Water Day has just been a treasure trove of insight, inspiration, and knowledge. And I'm so grateful to the panelists for saying yes to this conversation, and for those of you to come and bear witness and bring your hearts and thoughts and wisdom to the table as well. And Peter, beautiful facilitation. So that's all from me, other than let's just keep the conversation rolling and continue to align ourselves, as you put so beautifully, Michaela, with the small things we can do and those mighty acts that start adding up when so many of us do those small personal things together, that we really can change and shift the tide. So that's all from me. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Happy Water Day, every day. Thank you to the waters
Yes,
within
thank
you.
you. Thank you so much for attending today. Yeah, really appreciate everyone.